All right, one of the first things we have to do is deconstruct the prompt a little bit. So in the following passage from Maria Edgeworth's 1801 novel Belinda, the narrator provides a description of Clarence Hervey, one of the suitors of the novel's protagonist, Belinda Portman. Mrs. Stanhope, Belinda's aunt, hopes to improve her niece's social prospects and therefore has arranged to have Belinda stay at the fashionable Lady Delacour. Read the passage carefully and then write an essay in which you analyze Clarence Hervey's complex character as Edgeworth describes it through such literary techniques as tone, point of view, and language. So in a prompt like this, it looks like a lot, but don't be confused. This part here really has nothing to do with your prompt task. This is just kind of backgrounds to kind of help you understand the text that you're jumping into. Really what we're looking at here is this last part, which is our actual prompt task. And we're asked to do two things during these prompts. We need to identify the what of the prompt, and we need to identify the how of the prompt, right? What is it that we're commenting on, and how does the author accomplish that? The what here, analyze Clarence Hervey's complex character, right? And then we are asked how, like what literary techniques does the author use to do that? How does Maria Edgeworth, our author, help develop this complex character? Now they give us some options here. You're not bound to those, although you know that you can certainly be looking for those as we kind of complete the text. So one of the biggest things I try to do is rewrite this as a question, because I think it's easier to write an answer to that as your thesis statement. So I would say, how does Maria Edgeworth develop Clarence Hervey's complex character? Right, and I think if we can create an answer to that question, then you're on your way to a great thesis statement. All right, let's jump in. Clarence Hervey might have been more than a pleasant young man if he had not been smitten with the desire of being thought superior in everything and of being the most admired person in all companies. All right, so it's this idea that like he might have been more of a pleasant young man if he had not been smitten with the desire of being thought superior, right? So it's like, so is he really? Right, our narrator seems a little sassy here, right? It's like, oh, he would have been a good guy, right, if he actually wasn't terrible. Okay, and I think this is an important piece here, right? Smitten with the desire of being thought superior in everything and of being the most admired person in all companies, right? So almost here, it's like, this tells me that he's self-important. He's worried about his reputation. He's like, more so than him actually being great, he's more concerned with the idea that people think he's great. He had been early flattered with the idea that he has been a man of genius, right? So people have told him this. And he imagined that as such, he was entitled to be imprudent, wild, and eccentric. He affected singularity in order to establish his claims to genius. Right? He had considerable literary talents by which he was distinguished at Oxford, right? So it seems like he is talented. Again, just a side note right here, all I'm doing here is commenting on his character, right? Because ultimately we have to comment on Clarence Hervey's complex character. So anything I can say about his character, that's kind of what I'm making notes on right now. He had considerable, I already read that. But he was so dreadfully afraid for passing for a pedant that when he came into the company of the idle and the ignorant, he pretended to disdain every species of knowledge, right? Dreadfully afraid of passing for a pedant, and when he came into the company of the idle and ignorant, he pretended to disdain every species of people, right? So again, I think more than anything else, right, he's afraid of his reputation. He doesn't want to associate with anybody that might be seen as idle or ignorant because he's afraid people might think that he is also idle or ignorant. His chameleon character seemed to vary in different lights and according to the different situations in which he happened to be placed. To be honest, I think this is one of our most important parts here already, because if we're going to ask to be commenting on his complexity as a character, right, there's not a whole lot that's more complex than this metaphor here of a chameleon, right? And I'll also write metaphor. It's a potential literary device I could use. Seemed to vary in different lights. Okay, he could be all things to all men and to all women. He was supposed to be a favorite of the fair sex, and of all of his various excellencies and defects, there was none of which he valued himself so much as on his gallantry. So I will say, it sounds like he's a pretty talented individual, right? He was supposed to be a favorite, so he's probably good looking. He's got various excellencies, although some defects. He prides himself on being gallant, right? He was not profligate, so he had a strong sense of humor, quick feelings about humanity. So again, all of this, I'd say he's probably a little judgmental of other people. But again, he is talented. I think that's going to be really important. That's the second time now that we've noticed that he's talented. But he was also so easily led, or rather so easily excited by his companions, or his companions were now of such a sort, that it was probable that he would soon become vicious. Vicious in the sense of like vices, full of vices. As to his connection with Lady Delacour, he would have started with horror at the idea of disturbing the peace of a family, but in her family, he said there was no peace to disturb. Okay, so he's like, oh, I wouldn't want to disturb the peace of the family, but in this particular family, I assure you, there's no peace to disturb, right? So it seems like he's kind of judging here. So again, back to this idea of judgment. He was vain of having it seen by the world that he was distinguished by a lady of her wit and fashion, and he did not think it incumbent on him to be more scrupulous or more attentive to the appearances than her ladyship. Right, so again, this idea, he was vain of having it seen to the world that he was distinguished by a lady of her wit and fashion. Right, yet again, right, reputation. He's worried about that. By Lady Delacour's jealousy, he was sometimes provoked, sometimes amused, sometimes flattered. He was constantly of all her ladyship's parties in public and private. Consequently, he saw Belinda almost every day, and every day he saw her with increasing admiration and beauty, and with increasing dread of being taken in to marry a niece of the catch matchmaker, the name by which Mrs. Stanhope was known amongst most men. Yeah, so this is interesting, right? We see some complexity here, and I'll explain that in just a minute. All right, he's complex because every day he sees her with increasing admiration of her beauty, right? So on one hand, like he digs her, right? He digs Belinda, and he thinks she's, pretty attractive. But he also sees her with increasing dread of being taken in to marry, right? So it's like this idea that he won't be with her even though he thinks she's gorgeous. He won't be with her because he's worried about what other people think. Young ladies who have the misfortune to be conducted by these artful dames are always supposed to be partners in their speculations, though their names may not appear in the firm. We have another metaphor here. I'm starting to think that metaphor is something I'll use. If he had not been prejudiced by the character of her aunt, Mr. Hervey would have thought Belinda to be undesigning and an unaffected girl. But now he suspected her of artifice in every word, look, and motion, and even when he felt himself most charmed by her powers of pleasing, he was most inclined to despise her. God, man. Yeah, so this is huge. Even when he felt himself most charmed by her powers of pleasing, right? He's like, man, I'm digging this girl. He was most inclined to despise her, right? And it's like, why was he inclined to do that, right? And it might be just because he's just a terrible person, right? But really, I think it comments on his character, right? His complex character, right? He's so worried about his reputation. Okay, what he thought for such premature proficiency in scientific coquetry. He had not sufficient resolution to keep beyond the sphere of her attraction, but frequently when he found himself within it, he cursed his folly and drew back with sudden terror. Man, it's the same thing. Right, such complexity. Right, he finds himself being drawn in, right? Oh, man, I really want to be with her. And then he curses his folly, right? He says to himself, I can't do that. Because he's afraid of what others will think. So I think it's pretty clear. We can see Clarence Hervey's complex character, I think, after kind of going through that. Now the question is, how do we define that, right? Because ultimately we have to create sort of a thesis statement. So I don't know. I guess as far as brainstorming goes, what are our big takeaways? How would I define his characteristic? He's complex. He's paradoxical in some sense because, on one hand, he thinks these things and he's good at these things, but he shuts down his talents and he shuts down his feelings for them just because he's afraid about what others will think. Also a paradox in the sense that he's afraid of other people's judgments, but he seems to be really judgmental himself. He's got a high opinion of himself. He thinks he's too good to be associated with minds of their caliber. High opinion of self. I think he is definitely talented. We commented on that a couple times. And most importantly, I'll put a star on that. He is worried about his reputation. right? And in some sense, like, this is debilitating. Him being worried about his reputation is debilitating in some sense, right? So I think I can describe the what of the prompt, right? The what is, what is his complex character? I think that tells us there, right? So now let's talk about the how. Let's talk about literary devices. How does Maria Edgeworth, do that? I always say, and I've heard this at an AP training before, contrast is a really good literary device or technique to use. And I think contrast is going to be really important. There's contrast in language. How many times did we look at the text and say, oh, there's a contrast here. It's this, but this. So contrast is really good. There's metaphor we commented on a couple times. The chameleon metaphor. Right, so I think a metaphor would be pretty good. In some sense, we could talk about the point of view. It's a judgmental point of view, and I guess that works with tone too. And so you'll see already, I've got 3 literary devices. You could certainly spend some time looking for more, but even in just my quick reading before, that's something that I think, we can see. All right, so after we identify really in our brainstorming sort of the what and the how of the prompts, really I think our biggest task is going to be just trying to create an answer to this question, right? Which ultimately is going to be our thesis statement. So if you just turn your paper over, all right, what we're going to do is try to create, an answer to that question. So I'd say in this excerpt, author Maria Edgeworth, and I would normally write out her whole name, crafts a, let's say, paradoxically complex character in Clarence Hervey. Specifically, now we need to kind of get specific about how she does that. So here I've identified the what of the prompt. He's a paradoxically complex character. Right, now I need to comment on the how, though. Specifically, her use of contrasting language. All right, it's my first literary device. A metaphor comparing Clarence Hervey to a chameleon. And a judgmental tone. Her use of contrasting language and metaphor and a judgmental tone help to portray Clarence Hervey as a, let's say, self-contradictory mess. Right, so ultimately, it's a really simple paragraph. It's 2 sentences, but we identify him as a self-contradictory mess, a paradoxically complex character, but then also we talk about how we do that. It's through the contrasting language. It's through the metaphor, comparing him to a chameleon, and the author's judgmental tone. And so I think that's what we're looking for as far as our thesis statement is concerned. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to walk you through me writing a paragraph. What I did is I took some time as I paused the video just to go ahead and type a body paragraph. So one of my literary devices in my thesis was that they use metaphors. The author uses metaphors to do that. And so here's an example of what one of my body paragraphs would look like. And I want you to notice sort of the how I try to incorporate the text and then how I go on to explain the text, because ultimately my analysis is what matters the most. So what I said about metaphors and how it reveals his self-contradictory and paradoxically complex Clarence Hervey, you'll see this here. Edgeworth effectively uses metaphor to highlight the paradoxical complexity of Hervey's character by showing him as both opinionated and self-important, while also being easily influenced by the opinions of the company he keeps in society. The narrator describes his chameleon character, which seemed to vary in different lights and according to the different situations in which he happened to be placed. You'll see my text citation there. And by doing so, Edgeworth draws a comparison between the chameleon changing color to fit in with its environment and Clarence's behavior in different situations. Through this, the author develops Clarence's personality as subject to influence and change based on the people he's around. While he, on one hand, sees Belinda as a desirable companion, and a quote here to support that, he had not sufficient resolution to keep beyond the sphere of her attraction. But when he considers what others will think of him, he panics and draws back into sudden terror. Edgeworth then discloses a somewhat contrasting personality trait through the metaphor. Young ladies who have the misfortune to be conducted by these artful dames are always supposed to be partners in the speculations, though their names may not appear in the trim. So there's another metaphor there that we noticed. This metaphor draws a parallel between the girls who are supposedly given a say in who they are matched up with, as well as a partner in a business who is given no public representation or credit. So there's another comparison there. This metaphor, unlike the first, shows Clarence's low opinion of the system of matchmaking, which helps to develop his character as being highly opinionated and self-important. Through these two metaphors that illustrate contrasting character traits, Edgeworth reveals the paradoxical complexity of Hervey's character.